ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So no, but this is very, very valid point, very important. So now I have two questions on what I would have called loosely the heart and the mind. You know, the yin and yang of human existence, the poetry and the Schrödinger equation, music and science, whichever way one might wish to partition those. So I have a question from Madison, and that question is, what are your thoughts on spirituality and its importance in the 21st century? How can spirituality intersect with the world of science and technology? And a related question from Alyssa, do you believe that intersectionality exists between the world of science and the world of art?
Well,
So,
let me ask you first, Shania. What do you think of these things? And maybe I can jump in then.
okay, well, we can try that. Now, the first thing I had to switch on whichever the neurons in my head that are responsible for word decomposition analysis, and I'd never heard the word intersectionality before. I think I can imagine that it's something to do with things overlapping with other things. I would say, sometimes one might get stuck writing a grant or a paper and not feeling very successful at it. Everybody who's done science for a while will know that feeling. And then, but that feeling is in a specific part of your head that is you as a scientist. And sometimes I notice if I'm alert and aware enough in the moment to just say to myself, now you draw the line, go do something else. You are like your advice with how to deal with nasty reviews, go buy yourself an ice cream cone and come back to it tomorrow. I love that. Yes, so kind of like that. I take the cello, perhaps, and maybe I'll play some Bach. Maybe I'll just improvise a little bit. Sometimes it's the best way to release emotional frustration is to just improvise, do something that takes you in an unknown direction. Can be wonderful. And but what it does is much more. It actually really takes you from that part of you as a scientist and transplants you somehow. You become a different person almost, I would say. And but it is of course still you. It's still the same person, but you feel different, you act different, you may find you develop.
When you do the art,
Yes,
other than what you do the science, you feel
yes,
like a different person.
yes, I would say that there is definitely that potential. And then, of course, once you've done it enough and you realize you are the same person, then you may start integrating the two things, sort of, and saying, well, Leonardo did it, he was incredible.
Yeah,
Outstanding
we
people are
can't
great by
be all
definition.
we can't
Uh,
be all Leonardo, but one can still look for similarities
yeah.
and differences between art and science. I think there are some um, there are some interesting. There are many similarities. I have a whole lecture on this,
Oh,
and it's very hard for a professor not to talk for less than an hour. But so I don't, some way I don't want to get started. Um, one one similarity is both art and science, and it's an interesting similarity, are both in some way about creation. That is, it's clear for art, whether it's a new painting or a new song, the one can argue about whether it's been stolen from some other culture or some other song. But these are new things. And the same is true about science. It's particularly easy for chemistry because we make new molecules that haven't been unearthed before. But the interesting thing uh, being about both involving creation is there are two things. One is that it it makes you see. Sometimes scientists are typed as the creators of pollution, for instance, just to be specific, as the creators of the artifactual, the synthetic, the man or human made. But what the heck is art? Does sculpture grow on trees? Yes, trees are beautiful, but sculpture does not grow on trees. Sculpture is made by a human being. So now comes the next part, and on this one, the scientists don't do so well. And that is, when you have an act of creation, and that goes for a new molecule, a sculpture, or a baby, there is an ethical question attached. Is that act of creation good? Does it hurt people or not? Now, here is where, first of all, artists don't think that they ever deal with questions of ethics, but they do. I have had friends who have, of course, written about their former wives in novels, and you can bet that they didn't write very well about them. And they have committed acts of ethical transgression in using other people's lives to write their own. But it's the scientists who, in particular, in general, avoid questions of ethical responsibility. They tend to think that pure science is always good science, but you have to be very careful about this. And I think both artists and scientists need to ask ethical questions of their creation. How did I get into this? I was talking about one similarity between art and science.
Yes, well, sometimes to define a similarity, one has to look and say, what are the differences? And then you sort of like, what was it Michelangelo said when they asked him, how do you make your sculpture? He said, very easy. I take a piece of rock and remove everything superfluous, or something like that. So, you know, the differences are, you know, what we remove and where, yes. Yeah,
well, there are other differences. One interesting one philosophically is that in science, by and large, ambiguity is not a good thing. That something mean two things was in the way that energy was not, and power were not clearly defined, was a barrier to the formation of modern thermodynamics, which came only once you defined them and you defined work and power properly, and you got the idea of entropy being generated in any process. That in a poem, a word mean two different things and sound like 5 other words, that's a good thing. That's a good thing for the poem.
If you get into music, you know, my father, I've learned this from my dad, who's great at, you know, answering.
I don't know if the students know that he's a great composer.
Yes, thank you.
I can say it.
Yes, yeah, I shouldn't, but I can agree with you. Yes, I remember when I was 4 and my grandmother asked me, do you know any composers? I said, of course I do. She said, I'll name one. I said, Raskatov. I said, my dad. I said, okay, can you name any others? And I couldn't because I didn't know what the word composer means. So, so there's your knowing and learning and understanding all of those things mean different things. But
there was another question was about spirituality. Zhenya, what do you think about spirituality?
What do I think about spirituality?
You think it exists?
I think, therefore I am. You know, it's an interesting, the fact that we talk about it means that it's important to people, because if it wasn't important, we wouldn't be talking about it. And if it's important, something that doesn't exist cannot be important to so many people. That's what I would say. I don't know.
Yeah. So we have to move away with spirituality from religion.
Yes.
And one interesting thing is that the New Age movement, which is 2 generations ago, but which is now firmly embedded in the consciousness, especially of younger people, that has solved that problem. That is, today, when someone says they're spiritual, no one assumes that they're religious.
Mm.
That wasn't true, I tell you, 100 years ago at all. The two were intimately tied together in some way. But there are other ways to spirituality. I think scientists, that spirituality is important. I think you can find it. It's important to find it in your life. And I would like to work to find it in science. And if you are fortunate, there are some ideas that you can get in science which are so pleasing to the human spirit that you call them spiritual.
Yeah.
I ask the students to think about something in their scientific learning, which when they saw it was so elegant or explained so many things or explained one particular thing very well. Those are the main sort of qualities of that it becomes a spiritual experience to learn it. And you get a kind of high, a mental high from having learned it. And I don't want to reduce that high to endorphins being generated. There is something else that's happening on the level of consciousness. I think spirituality is important for science, to answer that question.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's a great answer. I mean, one thing that I have come to appreciate, and I spent a few years of being a very strongly, strong atheist, until at some point I got to the point of realizing that if you're so strong about saying that there is an absence of something, that by itself can also become a religion. And
that's right.
So that sort of turned me off from atheism. That didn't make me religious, but I just said, I don't know. And sort of like Richard Feynman said, I love this quote of Richard Feynman: I can live with doubt and uncertainty and not knowing. I think it's much more interesting to live not knowing than to have answers which might be wrong. A beautiful quote. And so I sort of gravitated my way towards that way of feeling about the world. And I think that Richard Feynman was a very spiritual person in a sense.
I think it's important for every human being to find ways to be spiritual. We often don't give ourselves the time. So the time is important. And actually, it's a time of contemplation, of thinking, going out on a starlit night. Right now, up in the sky, Saturn and Jupiter are as close as possible to each other as they will be in a very long time. And I would urge everyone to take the time and go out on a clear night before the fog rolls in, which doesn't happen very often, and to look at this, to see if you can spot Saturn and Jupiter.
That's interesting. I haven't done that. I should put it on my to-do list.
Give you a spiritual high.
Yes, this is great. Now, here is another difference between science and the arts, which at least I perceive as somewhat of a difference. There is always going to be science lives through, iterative improvement of things, I would say, to a degree. Of course, there is the moment where you have the eureka, like the Woodward-Hoffmann rules is, of course, one such example. But, that would probably be a whole different series of lectures. There is, most of science is incremental, right? You start with something that was there before you started, and then you take it, build on it, build, and build. So then, there is, at some point, Knowles came up with what was the best hydrogenation catalyst at the time. But then, since then, people have come up with so many others. And so he no longer holds, my point being this: Beethoven, when he wrote his Fifth, there is no better way to do the way he did it. That's it. Nobody will ever go and say, I'm going to make my version of Beethoven.
Mm.
Fifth Symphony. And so I think that's why, the arts draw people in, even though it's known that making money with arts, if it's real arts, is not going to be easy. But people are drawn to this because of that, I think, in part. In part, because they don't have a choice. It's stronger than that's what they are. So they just walk their path. Okay.
Okay, let's take the next section.
Yeah, so let's, come to the concluding section, student life. And that one I can probably do a bit faster because it's a little bit less abstract, I would say. And then there are two questions, one from Brittany, that is, what is your advice for first generation students that are interested in research? And a question from Rahul, what is your view on hardships? And what would you say to a student who might be going through?
So on first generation and research, so I'm not sure of the signifier of first generation here, but about research, it's a good thing. So let me tell you, one obvious reason is you are fated to be at UC Santa Cruz or at Cornell in rather large classes in your beginning courses, introductory chemistry, organic chemistry. You will get an antidote to that if you get yourself as quickly as possible into a research group. Get out of those large classes. Then you will see what science is really. And what you'll find yourself in is in a small community called a research group, which is like a family. It may have 5, it may have 20 people, but it's a group of people who are intensely interested in the subject, and they meet sometimes with structure, sometimes without structure, once a week. They talk about recent papers in the literature. It's where you find out that it's possible to publish a paper in a best journal, which is junk, and you find out that there are good papers published in obscure journals. You find out all kinds of things which are not in the textbook in one way or another. And then you also learn, you get criticized, you learn how to present, talk. Everything gets mixed up that's in, you learn something about research. And for me, it's what kept me going in college in science when my science courses were not so interesting. That's not true for you, but I strongly advise getting into research as quickly as possible. You have anything to say about that?
Well, I would certainly second that. And what comes to my mind, I heard this when I was doing my DPhil in Oxford. Believe I may have heard it attributed to Malcolm Green, who passed away recently, unfortunately, I believe. Something along the lines of, I read and I forget, I discuss and I remember, I do and I understand. And I thought that was a very nice, I thought that was a very good way of putting it into words, something that we feel somehow, we feel faster than we think somehow. So we may have a feeling about something, but then somebody comes to us and say, well, explain what you're talking about. You say, I don't really know, but he did it, and it was a good way. And this is, so I think it's very, very important to not just read, although reading is certainly better than watching. Nowadays, what do people say? I read an audiobook. Yes, there is room for audiobooks, but when you read like a real book, it's much better. And so, reading, but then discussing is, of course, taking it to the next level. But then when you actually go in and do the experiment or set up a calculation, actually find out what it means to diagonalize a matrix, or I don't know, whatever it is that you might be doing, make a peptide, work with amyloid beta, yes, if you are particularly lucky.
The other question, Zhenya, was about what to do with hardships and obstacles and things that go wrong within your life. So it's in the human condition that this should happen. And one way also to define human beings is even if there are no hardships, they'll make them for themselves.
Yeah.
And of the hardships, though, that are real for people, some of them may be caused by financial, economic realities, by other things, but very often I think what's referred to are psychological difficulties. Something doesn't go right in one way or another. It could be an exam, but more likely a relationship. Hold on a moment. Here we go. The strategy in general for dealing with hardships is, I would say, to this similar to what are good strategies for getting out of depression. And at some point, you may need medical help, and that there comes such point in depression, for instance. But
Yes.
when you are at a stage where the situation does not yet require some intervention, then some good strategies are set for yourself a variety of small tasks which are capable of being completed.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. That's very important.
As small as reading a column in a magazine to the end, or of solving a homework problem. Forget about the overall problem. Just get yourself through by solving the problems one by one, or not solving them in one way or another. The second thing that helps is anything in the world that gets you out of thinking about yourself and gets you thinking about other people. So that volunteering for something, to tutor in a high school, to help somebody else when they don't understand something. These are very salutary actions. They help you, though you don't realize it, because you are not focusing on yourself and your misery, and you get out and think about somebody else. And those are two general things I found that are useful.
Yes. No, those are very, very valid, very valuable points. I'll add from my own humble collection of experiences and stories, because, I've moved all over the world, and if you move all over the world and all you have is one little bag, your family is far away, your friends are scattered all over the world. It can be beautiful, I have friends in a half a dozen, if not more than that, countries where I could go and stay at their place and they wouldn't kick me out, surprisingly. So that can feel good. But there are days where you start thinking, oh, I want to spend time with this person, that person is in Israel or Germany or whatever. It starts feeling like, yeah, you may start getting a little overwhelmed. And one thing that I have to say, I think I agree completely, having small doable tasks. I found, for example, that having a cat can do wonders, because you have a sense of responsibility.
Yes, you have to feed the cat. You have to empty their litter box.
Exactly, yes. And feeding is the part that I'm very, very, well regulated about. The other one, I still need to become perhaps a little bit better, but I think I'm still okay. But yes, but the one thing that I wanted to add is that I think I've read a lot of books on this stuff. It really interests me. And so it fascinates me. The human mind is a fascinating thing. It's a hopeless exercise, of course, because the brain trying to understand itself, it's a recursive problem.
Yes.
We get so and so far with it. But I think that people make these mistakes nowadays quite frequently, that they say it's either all medication or it's all meditation.
Yes.
But then, you don't have to actually choose, because each one of the two can do valuable, important things for you in a specific context. And sometimes you may find that, I would always say learning to meditate is a good thing. If you learn it from somebody who's good at teaching, it's certainly a good thing. It may not work if you're going through some real serious hardship, you may need to do more than that. But that doesn't mean that meditation is worthless. So I think it's not, people are too keen to ask either or types of questions, I
Yes.
think, sometimes. And it's important to realize that the reality is more complex than a binary answer most of the time, really.
So I think maybe it's time that we wind this up because
Yes.
we're going for an hour.
Yes.
You edit it down and human patience stops at some point.
Yeah.
Anyway, I want to say that I'm very glad to meet indirectly the young people who listen to this. And please ask questions of your professor. You can also ask of me. You won't have any trouble finding my email. And just enjoy the stage of life that you're at. There is a lot of things to learn, and it's just wonderful what's waiting for you. Be well.
Yes. Thank you so much, Roald. Thank you for making the time to talk and to look at the questions. Deeply appreciated. Thank you very much.
Okay, we can go.